Hello, everyone, and welcome to GLF Live. I'm Gabrielle Lipton, the editor of the Global Landscapes Forum's news platform, Landscape News, and today is the second part of a GLF Live series on fires. On Tuesday, we heard from experts about the fires in Siberia, Russia, Indonesia, and Australia. And today we have two fantastic experts who are going to share with us about the fires in California and the west coast of the United States and in the Amazon and in Brazil. We have Leila Salazar Lopez, who's the executive director of Amazon Watch, which works to protect the Amazon through the advancement of its indigenous people's rights. She also serves on the council of the Amazon Emergency Fund and is a voting member for Greenpeace. And we also have with us Daniel Nepstad, the president and founder of Earth Innovation Institute, who worked in the Amazon for more than 30 years and has his name on more than 160 publications about Amazonian policy, frontier dynamics, and ecology. So thank you so much to you both for joining us today. We're so excited to hear from you. And both of you are joining us from California. Dan, you're in Berkeley, and Leila, you're in the San Francisco area. So we'll start there. It's the worst year for fires in the state's recorded history. And as of right now, I checked the California Fire Department website today, and more than 4 million acres have burned, 31 lives have been lost, and there are 16,500 firefighters on the ground working to contain 22 active fires. And the fire department says that 95% of these fires have been started by human activity. So can you just start by telling us what it's like where you are right now? What's the air quality like? What's life like living in these fires? Leila, we can start with you.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and good morning, everyone. Since mid-August, we've been on constant fire watch here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it started with, a heat wave, which we were all excited for. We were all excited for, the warm weather and being able to be outside. But that warm weather led to thousands, over 20,000 lightning strikes, which sparked fires all across the state, primarily in Northern California. And those fires, most of which are wildfires, engulfed the state. I was going to say engulfed the Bay Area, but engulfed the state in toxic smoke. And, as I was mentioning earlier, we've been feeling these fires for the last few years. The last 3 years in particular have been particularly tough. But this year is historic. This year surpassed all of the previous fires combined. Over 4 million acres of land have burned just in California, and another million in Oregon and Washington. And I would like to say this is not the new normal, but our normal here in the Bay Area has been constantly checking the AQI. I have like 4 different apps on my phone looking at what's the air quality like. Usually you look at what the weather's like, but now we're also looking at what's the AQI, what's the air quality like? Can I go outside? Can my kids go to the park today? And you all probably saw videos of the day when the sky was orange, the day when we woke up and it was still dark. It was almost like, did I wake up at the wrong time? The sky was dark and orange almost all day long. And that was in September. And since then, it's, we've had a 2-week break of clean air, and then a new major fire started in Napa and Sonoma County 2 weeks ago. And even just yesterday, we thought the air looked fine, and then I went outside and it was unhealthy. So that's our normal right now, unfortunately.
Mhm. Daniel, how about for you? How has it been up in Berkeley, and what are you making of these fires?
We moved to Berkeley from Indonesia, where we were for a year and a half, and so we're familiar with smoke. A lot of the agricultural systems in Indonesia depend upon fire, and but we really are. I'm so struck by how climate change is coming into our lives, our everyday lives. And while we see, okay, the Arctic ice pack is receding, we see we're having our 10th hurricane or major storm hit the shores of the United States and the Gulf of Mexico, and we're only in early October. That's more than in any year. The other record is 9 in a given year. But fire is really that much more personal. Well, if you're in the path of a hurricane, it's very personal, but personal connection with climate change. And I think Californians are just feeling it so keenly right now. We were trying to take vacation in August when the day we got to Loyalton, a huge fire broke out. And I was really struck by, as a fire ecologist, we went out and drove little kids in the car to look at the fire. And there were 7 airplanes, including a very large airplane and military airplanes, 5 helicopters, 700 people mobilized around a single fire. And when the sheriff came around to our Airbnb, he said, this group of houses will be safe, so we'll let you know as soon as you need to leave. And 3 hours later, they said, you need to leave. And it feels like we've been breathing smoke ever since. As Layla mentioned, it comes into your home. You keep the windows shut. You're constantly looking at the purple air quality maps to see if you're going to, if the winds are going to favor your particular neighborhood that day, or if they're going to move the smoke elsewhere to torment other people's lives. So it really feels a little bit like canary in the mine shaft of this is the new system that California has to deal with. These are fire-dependent forests, basically where fire has been suppressed for decades, and we're now paying the price as these incredible hot events come along that, as Layla said, include dry lightning strikes, which can set multiple fires off across the state.
Mm-hmm. And so these lightning strikes and global warming and climate change, it's a whole combination of factors that's leading to these fires. There have also been, I believe, more than 70 people arrested because of arson in the state as well. So what is the recipe of factors that's led to these fires on the West Coast? Dan, we can start with you.
Yeah, it's really extremely flammable ecosystems, lots of biomass, because there have not been the prescribed burns or the natural burns. They've been suppressed. Basically, Californians love to live in the forest like everyone else, and we've moved into the forest ecosystems and the chaparral of the coast. And the reasons for the fires, though, climate change makes events in years like this much more likely. So there is a clear signal of climate change that just makes the weather so extreme. Without that, then the speed of at which the forest fires move across the landscape, the likelihood of dry lightning events. So usually lightning is followed and accompanied by rainfall. So if there is a fire, it goes out right away. The likelihood of those events is much higher with climate change. So nothing else really changed. There's not, people out there deliberately trying to set fires. There's a lot of accidental fires. But the real focus has to be climate change. We have to assume that this is not a one-off anomaly, that this is, as Layla said, this is the new normal.
Mm-hmm. Wanted to add that, since we used to, we've been talking about for, at least the governments have been in global talks about climate change for 26 years now. And, we talk about, we used to talk about the climate, crisis in the future. But I could tell you that, definitely my feeling and the feeling of all of our community and family and friends and colleagues is it's now. It's not 10 years in the future. it's now. And when we're talking about climate change and emissions, we're not just talking about cars and trucks and airplanes and factories anymore. And fires are a major contributor to global greenhouse gases. Just the fires this year in California have generated over 91 million metric tons of CO2, which is about 25% more than the state's annual emissions. So we've surpassed our emissions already in California. And so luckily we're in a state where the state government is acknowledging science, is acknowledging that that we're in a climate emergency, that we need to really seriously take action on climate change. And there's lots of ways to address that, which I won't go into right now.
Do you think the state, because last year's fires were devastating as well, so in the run-up to this year's fire season, do you think the state was prepared enough and taking enough action, especially in the midst of a global pandemic? Was it able to, or would you have liked to see your government do things differently?
I think California is taking important strides to deal with the fire issue more effectively. There has to be a much larger share of the state's forests, which are extensive, burned every year. Prescribed burns, you set the forest on fire and under cool conditions so the fires are not that severe. They basically use up the fuel and make the fires, if they occur, less severe. This is a big agenda for housing. We basically need a long-term strategy for getting people out of highly flammable landscapes, and those communities that are there and are not going to go away. There needs to be management around homes to fireproof homes, to reduce the fuel loads around those. The area of forest managed that is burned deliberately each year is going up. I believe this year it's something like 80,000 hectares. It needs to be up towards 300, 400,000. That is our long-term goal. There's many lessons to be learned from the indigenous communities of California. Not ironically, but some of them are actually getting payments from the state today to reestablish their traditional systems of forest management. So through the California domestic offset system, they're actually getting paid to reestablish forests and manage them in this fire-wise way. So we're definitely, though, still in a mindset of this is an emergency. Let's mobilize, pull out the volunteers, get airplanes dropping, fire retardant. My 7-year-old now knows what that word means and that it's red. And so we need to gradually keep up the early detection and fire combating as we implement a longer term strategy for reduced fire damages and fire crises that involve fundamental changes in housing patterns.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting about the payment to the indigenous peoples and their practices. Could you describe what some of those practices are?
Indigenous people before colonization, they knew how to manage these ecosystems extremely well, and they would manage them to favor game. They would manage them to prevent fires that are catastrophic. They knew they had to keep fuel loads down, and they knew also that productivity and the amount of game that the landscape supported increased. After a fire, there's a flush of regrowth of grasses. There's a lot of nutrients hitting the soil, so the plants that are sprouting up tend to be more nutrient rich, more palatable. So you can actually get greater game production if you have an occasional fire every 10 to 15 years. And so while there's been huge incursions into indigenous territories in California, there's actually some groups like the Yurok. They're actually reclaiming some of their ancestral lands, some of their ancestral artifacts, and implementing once again those fire management prescribed burn regimes.
Mm-hmm.
there was actually a recent article in NPR that talked about both the Yurok and Karuk and also Mono tribes, and it actually said that before 1800, so before colonization in California, million acres were burned every year in California due to indigenous burns and management. And also lightning caused fires. Those are not new. They're just more extensive and they've just increased. So they had prescribed burns. That's the way they managed the forest. But they were low grade fires to shape the landscape and also encourage certain plants to grow, for example, for weaving baskets and for their livelihoods. And it was also a spiritual practice. And I know from allies at Seventh Generation Fund in Northern California that there are a lot of indigenous lands that have also burned and affected indigenous peoples on their reservations and in their lands. And they want to, this is, in addition to, the Yurok, many indigenous peoples in California want to, continue doing their traditional fires to manage the land and prevent these massive fires. But the reality is, the forest and communities, there's a lot of people, and housing and buildings and structures in California. So it really has to be managed in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we'll return to the topic of indigenous peoples in a bit, but I want to move down to what's happening in the Amazon as well, which is experiencing its worst year for fires since 2012. And September had 61% more hotspots this year than it did last year. And the Pantanal region as well, the Brazilian wetland region, more than a fifth of it has burned since July. So could you perhaps, Dan, describe the recipe of factors that's led to such devastating fires happening again in the Amazon and in Brazil this year?
Yeah, and so really different systems, okay? California forests, everything from redwoods to chaparral to Sierra coniferous forests, burn quite frequently historically. And in the Amazon, the return interval of fires is every 400, 700 years, once again, before colonization. And every now and then, the Amazon would be hit by these extreme droughts and fires set to manage forests, to prepare fields for cultivation, would escape into the forest, but it was every few centuries. And now we're into a regime, I should say, where that's happening a lot more frequently. What's going on this year, we have to break up the fires, so there's this metric that everyone uses, which is hot pixels or fire counts. Basically, if a little patch of land exceeds a thermal threshold picked up by the Modus Aqua sensor, it's registered as a fire. Most of what that is seeing are fires set deliberately to burn patches of cleared forest or pastures that are ignited to knock back the weedy invaders. So that's mostly what we're getting. This year, there's more hot pixels in forest areas than last year. Most of those are degraded forests that have been logged, forests that have been previously burned. We do not yet have a technique for picking up fires burning primary forests. And we've done a lot of experiments with this, and we set the fires one day and look for the signal on the satellite, and it's not there. These are tiny fires that are knee-high, and they just don't show up. That, for me, is the most worrisome type of fire, because it means that the Amazon, which is usually incredibly resistant to burning the primary forest without disturbance, is being pushed over the edge. It's experienced so much drought that so many leaves have fallen. It's had so much time to dry out that the forest floor of leaves and twigs that a usually fire-resistant ecosystem is starting to catch fire. So that started to happen this year. We know that because of people seeing those fires on the ground and the overall data explained by the hot pixels, the overall trend. I should note that fires are more extensive this year in the southern Amazon. So if you look at the Amazon as a whole, the Brazilian Amazon, we're actually have fewer fire incidents than in 2017 and far fewer than in 2010. So in that sense, it's not a precedent-setting year, okay? Anyway, quickly on the Pantanal. The Pantanal is a situation more similar to California. Most of the Pantanal, which is a flooded, it's a floodplain, it's an ecosystem, it's a patchwork of marshes and forests that are, when the rivers rise every rainy season, they're flooded. And cattle ranchers are out there literally wading through the water, and their horses with their cows wading on through the water, and they're called pantaneros, and they're used to using fire to manage their pasture, and it's actually a fairly sustainable system. But this year, the drought is just off the charts, and so what would normally be very tame, contained management fires are escaping. And so it's similar to California in that it's an ecosystem that burns quite a bit. But it's different in that it's not a residence. The crisis is not one of houses embedded in flammable landscapes. It's more this vast wildlife-rich ecosystem that's about half the size of California. It's huge, catching fire.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add that, the big difference between the fires in California and the Amazon, although there are, some fires, unfortunately, that are set in California, most are wildfires. And in Brazil, in particular, and in the Amazon, they're not wildfires. They are intentionally set. Whether they're small and contained or, turn into large fires, they are intentionally set, and what the indigenous people are calling criminal arson. And we're talking in 2020 so far. So we're not just talking about the fire season, which is, in August and September. And we're talking about the year so far. There's over 4 million acres have been burned across the Brazilian Amazon. In the first 10 days of September, the rates of fires were up 85%. I saw a graphic just the other day that was counting the hot spots, which Dan mentioned, and there were over 30,000 just in September. So yes, there are lots of fires across the Brazilian Amazon, and the Cerrado, which is the largest tropical savanna, right below the Amazon, and then the Pantanal. So the entire, this interconnected ecosystem is on fire. And it's not an accident. It is a result of criminal arson and government policies. I know we're going to get there, but people ask, people are seeing the horrific images of the fires in the Pantanal, and in particular the photos of the wildlife being impacted, and wondering, what caused this. And it's all related to also the climate and the hydrological system in the Amazon, right? It is related to deforestation. There is an increase. There's a historic increase in deforestation in the Amazon, which is directly tied to the increase in fires this year. And according to MAP, which is a monitoring of the Andean Amazon project, they actually recently put out their monthly report, and it says that 27% of the major fires so far in September in the Brazilian Amazon have been in primary rainforest. So that's really concerning, because yes, I agree, with Dan, and I'm not a scientist. I'm looking at all the data and looking at what our partners are saying on the ground in Brazil, that, yes, much of the fires are in areas that have been previously deforested or degraded. But according to MAP, there is an increase. At least in September, there was an increase in fires in primary rainforest, and that's really concerning. It's concerning because we need forest standing. We need, our position at Amazon Watch in support of our partners on the ground, Indigenous partners and communities, is we have to protect what's left. There really needs to be a commitment, and it's not just NGOs, it's communities, it's multi-stakeholder initiatives, companies calling for zero deforestation and a moratorium on deforestation. Some say 5 years, some say 10 years. Why is that? Scientists are also saying this, that are a part of a new initiative of climate scientists. And we're all coming together to say zero deforestation and a moratorium on any further destruction of the Amazon rainforest, because of the huge concern of the Amazon reaching the tipping point of ecological collapse, which, the numbers used to be a lot higher. The numbers used to be a lot higher in terms of what would it take to reach that point of ecological collapse. And now, Antonio Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy, many other scientists are saying that we're already at 17% of deforestation and degradation. And where they used to say, up to 50%, now it's more like 20 to 25%. So it's very concerning. And our position is really, we can't lose any more forest. So we can't lose any more forest. There needs to be zero deforestation. There needs to be a commitment to protecting primary rainforests and indigenous territories, which are the best protected at all costs.
Absolutely. And in terms of ecosystems like primary rainforests in the Amazon, or bringing it back to California, the redwoods and the sequoias, these really precious, really powerful and valuable ecosystems, parts of which have already been lost. What do we do now? Are there ways to restore? How do we, where do you go from there in terms of trying to do something to mitigate the loss of these very valuable ecosystems? Dan, can you comment on that?
Yeah, what strikes me is just how resilient these ecosystems are, and I think that's just great news for humanity. The Big Basin fire, for example, where intense fire in the redwoods, early indications are that the adult redwoods there will mostly survive. And whoever's walked through a redwood forest, you'll notice that there tends to be clumps of fires, and they're basically clumps of stems that resprout following fire damage. And almost every redwood tree you find has a fire scar. You go into the Sierra and trees are fire scarred. So nature is ready to deal with fire, and in many ways bounces back. The question is, will we overcome that capacity? It's something I've been studying a lot in the Amazon in the 80s. My work was on forest recovery after degradation and clearing. And with fire, about 10 to 50% of the adult trees, when a primary virgin forest catches fire, 10 to 50% of the trees die. And that's all a question of how severe the drought is. And that does happen some years. This year it is happening. We do not know how much. I really do think all the hot pixel based measurements, what they're picking up is mostly degraded forest. But putting that aside, if you leave a forest that's been burned alone, it will come back. We ran a big experiment in Mato Grosso where, beginning in 2004, we subjected 50-hectare plots of forest to experimental fires. And I got a lot of hate mail because of that experiment. But I always say it's actually to conserve the forest. We have to understand how it responds. And what I was really struck with we burned one plot every year. In 2007, these fires that usually go out about 10 p.m. at night, because as the humidity sets in, it's just not dry enough for them to burn. It was a particularly hot and windy night. And that night, the forest burned all night long. I've got a picture at 2 a.m. with fires knee height, and that's just unheard of. And that year, instead of 6% of the trees dying, it popped up to 50%. Enough trees died that grasses moved into the forest plot. Today, you go to that forest plot and you can't recognize it as a forest. And it was never saw a chainsaw. And that is happening more and more frequently around the Amazon, where we've overcome the resilience of the ecosystem, which, this is a tough forest. When it's damaged, it regrows. But if you get highly flammable plants into the understory, like grasses and bracken ferns and things like that, and they catch fire again, you basically overcome that capacity to rebound. So that's my greatest concern. I really share with Layla, we need to focus on this tipping point. I think before we get to that tipping point, we are already seeing a fire dieback underway, where 1998, we measured 40,000 square kilometers of primary forest that caught fire. And that was twice as much as was cleared by chainsaws. This year, that number is going to be up there. We don't know how big it is. And reinforcing too what Layla said, the best solution to prevent an Amazon tipping point, which could release 20, 30, 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. There's 400 gigatons of CO2 stored in the trees of the Amazon. That's almost a decade's worth of global human-wide emissions. The best way to keep that carbon in those forests is to slow deforestation and end it and reverse it. And so I'm really struck by the opportunity Brazil has. 50% of all the forests are protected in some way. Private land restricts clearing to 20% of a property. If those legal frameworks are fully implemented, that basically puts a brake on deforestation very soon. There's a mandated 8 to 10 million hectares of new forests that must be established to comply with the forest code. But farmers have 20 years to fulfill that. If we accelerate that with some incentives, we can basically reestablish the critical role of the forest in generating the rain that makes the Amazon rainforest a rainforest. And that means a big focus on the eastern part of the forest, since the winds blow from the east to the west. So to avoid a tipping point, to avoid the forest dieback, we have to slow and end deforestation and restore as much forest as we possibly can. We, the broader we.
And thank you for sharing that. I guess the obvious follow-up question then is, how does that happen? How do we ensure international pressure on President Bolsonaro? Is it empowerment of local indigenous communities and farmers? What's the combination you would like to see to slow deforestation and build back restoration efforts? Layla, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just want to add, I completely agree with Dan that, if we let the forest be, it will grow back. But yes, it will not, that won't happen in a year or 5 years, right? It takes time to, there's going to be, the fast growing trees, the cecropias, there's going to be the fast growing trees first, right? But, when we think of the majestic, sabo trees, the majestic trees that we love seeing in the Amazon, just like we love seeing the big redwood trees, it's heartening to know those big trees will survive. The rest may not, but will grow back. There's lots of initiatives, reforestation initiatives, and most of them are international initiatives that are, paired with, carbon offset initiatives. We're at Amazon Watch, we're really supporting, the natural growth and the support of Indigenous peoples in their community initiatives to restore forests and food forests, and agroecology projects on their own lands. Fire brigades to fight, Indigenous fire brigades to fight the fires, and then restore the forests that have been impacted. But that alone will not stop fires or deforestation with the continued and growing threats towards the forests and the Indigenous territories and the protected areas. There, from the latest stat I've seen is that deforestation since the Bolsonaro administration began almost 2 years ago, deforestation has gone up 96%. And why is that? Because similar to this country, similar to the United States, the environmental laws have been gutted. The environmental ministry, the Ministry to Protect Indigenous Peoples, FUNAI, the funding for these ministries and the have been gutted. And so if there isn't, if there isn't funding for the institutions, the government institutions to protect forests and Indigenous peoples' rights and lives and expansion of in the demarcation of their territories, they're going to be increasingly threatened, and that's exactly what has happened. And there's actually been policies by the government and government rhetoric to encourage encroachment, land grabbing, and threats against Indigenous peoples. We've seen this, throughout the last couple of years, and in particularly last year, we've seen an increase in direct, not just threats, but direct attacks and killings of forest guardians and defenders. Most people have heard about Paulino Wajajara in Maranhão, but he's only one of many. Global Witness has continued to say in their latest reports that Brazil continues to be one of the most dangerous places to be an environmental defender. And those environmental defenders in Brazil and in the forests are Indigenous peoples. And so APIB, which is the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, and COIAB, the Coordination of Indigenous Peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, are working tirelessly to defend their rights, their lives, or their rights that are guaranteed under the Brazilian Constitution, that are guaranteed in the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. They're working hard to defend their rights, their lives, their territories, but they're on all-out attack by these threats that I mentioned, but also by COVID-19. And I wanted to mention that because, we know that the traditional threats to the Amazon and its peoples, the agribusiness expansion, the industrial development with mining and oil, most particularly in the Western Amazon, we know about the roads and the mega dams, but COVID-19 has now become another threat towards the Indigenous peoples and all the peoples of the Amazon. And there's been over 130 different Indigenous nationalities that have been impacted by COVID-19. And because of that, we have a collaboration between Indigenous organizations, COICA, and NGO allies and donors to support an emergency response to COVID-19 called the Amazon Emergency Fund. And this is for rapid response for COVID impacts on the communities. And, it's important to mention that, if, we know that COVID attacks our respiratory system, it attacks our immune system. And, and so do fires. So does the smoke, it attacks our respiratory system. And then we can look at the broader Amazon and how it is, it is one of the vital organs of our planet that we need for this planet to maintain balance. And so what I'm trying to say here is that it's all connected. COVID, the fires, the climate, it's all connected. And we have to, at this time, what we're calling for is an Amazon ceasefire, and in support of indigenous peoples and traditional peoples across the Amazon, but really also looking at who's responsible, because it's not just the government. There are corporations who are complicit in this destruction. There are corporations that are benefiting from the agribusiness expansion, from the land grabbing, and there are investors that are investing in those companies, whether they know it or not, but they are complicit. And so that's why there are global initiatives to put pressure on the Brazilian government to talk about, to send letters of concern, like what was done just 2 weeks ago at the UN General Assembly in Climate Week. The Netherlands and France and many other European governments said, we're not going to trade if this continues. And many companies are now starting to look at their supply chains and where their commodities and investments are complicit in the destruction of the Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more transparency is absolutely key. And I agree, it was heartening to see the pressure that was put on Bolsonaro at the Biodiversity Summit of the UN and the General Assembly. And one thing that you mentioned in terms of COVID-19, which we've discussed in a separate GLF Live, but it's also it's a vicious cycle of sorts where deforestation can lead to the spread of emerging infectious diseases. So while COVID-19 is harming those already living there, it's the deforestation is also encouraging the spread of such diseases. And so it all ties back into one another, as you mentioned. So I just have one more question before we take some questions from the audience. We have quite a few questions coming in from Facebook and other platforms that I would like to get to. But my last question from my end is quite simple. What do you expect to see in the months to come? Dan.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just make a quick comment too on sort of what the solution is, because I think when I moved to the Amazon in 1984 to the frontier town of Paragominas, my biggest surprise was getting to know these pioneer families, both big cattle ranchers, loggers, logging companies, but also smallholders and some indigenous people, and the relationships they had between themselves, and the fact that they were there really trying to carve a living for themselves, mostly really good people who had, left humble means to go to the Amazon to find their opportunity. And that perception, I think, has really informed my whole view of the Amazon, which is that a polarized approach to the Amazon will not get us to a solution. We need pressure, and I have deep respect for Amazon Watch's work, for the other groups that are applying that pressure, but we also need partnerships on the ground. Mm-hmm. This year, the Kamayora in the Parque Indígena Xingu and the Upper Xingu, they had fires coming into their forests, and they called Alianza da Terra. I saw the formal letter, and to help. Alianza has a fire brigade of about 700 people. Half of them are indigenous people. And they knew, and the Alianza is an organization of cattle ranchers and farmers. I was with the founder of Alianza when he shook hands with one of the leaders of a Xavante tribe that was getting invaded. And a group of cattle ranchers basically helped the Shavanchi get through a hunger spell and eventually help get invaders removed from their land. And so I think we need sticks and pressure, and we need carrots and positive incentives. And right now, I think we're really short on incentives. So we need to keep up the pressure, get investors to pull away from bad investments, from destructive investments that are violating land rights, human rights. But we need to push investors and buyers into the Amazon that are doing the right thing. There's a lot of really great companies, farmers, producers in the Amazon that are pretty bitter. They feel like everyone has pulled out and they have been demonized generally. Instead of calling out the land grabbers, and I couldn't agree more with Leila, there's a huge problem of land grabbing and resource grabbing and exploitation of indigenous people and smallholders. But there are also a lot of responsible folks who want to do the right thing. It's virtually impossible today to comply with the forest code, for example. And that means that despite the inefficiencies of the government apparatus, you get labeled as illegal, even if you've done everything you're supposed to do. So in some, we need an emergency approach to this, which I think gets to those partnerships. I don't believe the fire bans really work. We need a long-term strategy that's actually going to support those good actors, win them over as allies in a forest-friendly development pathway for the Amazon. And that means a lot of new partnerships and new collaborations and investment flowing into the region. And as we look to the future, we are in an extended dry season right now. This year, the biggest problem is in the south of the Amazon, Mato Grosso and Pará. Pará is more in the middle, of course. The rains are late. The groups that are on the front lines fighting this, I just got a WhatsApp from Aline at the head of Alianza Brigade. They do not have enough money to fight the fires in the Parque Indígena Xingu. And this is a mixed fire brigade of indigenous people from the tribes of the Parque Indígena and farmers and volunteers. And so we have an immediate crisis and this remarkable shortage of funding. And the way COVID is moving into the indigenous tribes is sad. We've seen a lot of our collaborating indigenous leaders die or they're sidelined because of COVID. They need help urgently, and what Leila mentioned is so critical just to get that financial support in. But I think if we don't have a broad coalition for the Amazon, it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And a perfect example of that is, Brazil, under the leadership of Marina Silva in the mid 2000s. I remember we were at a soy moratorium meeting in Brazil. That's actually where I first met Dan. There were many multi-stakeholder initiatives that were successful, right? The soy moratorium. There were many initiatives. And right now, it just feels like complete lawlessness. And so I agree. There needs to be, as I mentioned before, it's government accountability and it's pressure, international pressure. Although the government really digs their heels in when they feel this international pressure, but there needs to be, a lot more multi-stakeholder and partnerships developed. I agree, and that's exactly why we collaborated to establish the emergency fund. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one question that just came in from Lori Goring is asking about the indigenous fire brigades on the ground in the Amazon. And she's wondering why funding for them has dried up this year and what could help reverse this and get those funding flows again. She's asking this to Dan. Leila, perhaps you have something to say to the Amazon Emergency Fund work as well. So we can start with Dan and then go to you perhaps. Yeah,
the Alianza Brigade, Alianza was created in 2004. The brigade is several years old. They put out dozens of forest fires, and they basically have had trouble landing grants and getting the donations they need to keep going. You know, a few weeks ago, the gap was $60,000. They went into the fire season last year with a total budget in hand of $80,000, and they needed, you know, 300. You know, I feel like there's tiny amounts of money that are preventing hugely impactful work from taking place. And I'd be happy to share later the link to their, you know, how you can get money to Alianza.te. There are other brigades out there as well. And so there's the official systems of fire brigades, and they've got much more budget and equipment and less knowledge in how you fight forest fires, ironically. And what we really need are early detection, volunteer networks, so that if someone sees smoke coming out of a forest, they know who to call. And then someone to organize those volunteers already trained to actually get out there and fight the fire. And one fire that I mentioned, California, 700 people. This one fire brigade for the state of Mato Grosso, which is a couple times larger than California, 700 people. So there's a huge discrepancy in manpower.
Mm-hmm. Layla, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I'm putting in some links in the chat as well. You know, this, as I mentioned earlier, the 7th Generation Fund of Indigenous Peoples, they actually have a fund called the Flickr Fund, which is for COVID relief, but it's also for fires. And it's specifically for communities, Indigenous peoples and communities impacted by fires in California. So I just put that there in case anybody is interested in supporting. And, you know, I just, you know, a call to action, I also included here the Amazon ceasefire campaign, which is a campaign that we're working on in support of demands by APB, the Articulation Peoples of Brazil, in calling on investors. You know, investors, we're talking about the biggest investors in fossil fuels, in agribusiness, who don't have policies on deforestation, who don't have indigenous rights policies, who don't have climate policies. So we're talking about massive asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. We're calling on those companies. We're calling on JP Morgan Chase to put pressure on these banks and these financial institutions to develop these policies to not invest in companies and projects that are destroying our climate, particularly the Amazon, because we know that there is no climate solution. There is no successful climate solution without protecting forests and protecting the Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you to you both for dropping some links in the chat box, and to those who are watching on YouTube or Facebook. I believe my colleagues can help get those links to you in a different way on the platforms that you're watching on. So thanks for that. We have another question, excuse me, that's come in through Facebook from Haikinus. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. But this goes back to something, Dan, you were talking about before, about the amount of dry debris and fallen trees on the ground in the Amazon, which catch fire more easily and just exacerbate the whole situation. So is there anything that can be done to reduce the amount of dead foliage and dead plant material on the ground in the Amazon, and therefore help prevent fires?
The great news is that a path, I can't see that, a 2 foot wide, half a meter wide path cut through the forest will stop a fire in a virgin forest. And you have to cut through with a sawmill, a saw chain, not a sawmill, the branches that have fallen across the path. If the fire gets close, you can set a back burn. And this takes a small number of people to basically keep a forest that could burn for 3, 4, 5 weeks and consume tens of thousands of hectares. So after that happens, if you get a severe dry season, if you keep the fire out of the forest, it won't catch on fire. And that has to be intrinsic to land use strategies across the Amazon. There needs to be training, funding, requirements to do that. It's much easier if you have a tractor and a blade. You can quickly put, a 4-meter fire break around your forest or around the area that you're about to burn in preparation for livestock or planting, to make sure that that fire doesn't get out of control. And it's 4 times more expensive to do it by hand with machetes, but you can do it there as well. So what we have today is really low-income producers who don't have the manpower, the machinery to really do good fire retention, fire containment investments. The fires are getting out of control, and it's burning their coffee groves, their cacao groves, their acai groves, and they do not want that fire to get away, but it's getting away. And the same with large-scale landholders. And so I think this is what strikes for me is everyone wants to solve the accidental fire problem. And if we can pull this together and get the resources to the people who need it most, and think about a development model that has more and more tree-based production systems, more income so people can invest in fire prevention, we can solve this fire issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really interesting anecdote about the 2-meter path. We have one more question that came in from Walt Zib, also on Facebook. And I'm going to broaden his question a little bit. He's asking about international mechanisms to avoid more loss of forests through the United Nations or other international cooperations. But I would like to broaden that out as well, based on the past GLF Live on fires and what speakers were talking about there, but also international cooperation in fighting fires and fighting loss of deforestation. And in times of pressure, like pandemics, or in times when fire seasons are lengthening within countries, so countries are perhaps less able to help other countries fight their own fires because their resources are already so stretched thin. What would you like to see happen with international cooperation around curbing these losses of deforestation and fighting fires? Layla, we can start with you.
There are a number of agreements. There's the Amazon Cooperation Treaty. There's the recent Leticia Pact that is the governments of all the different 9 Amazon countries made a pact last year in Leticia, Colombia. It's an extension and expansion of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty. And it does make commitments to, protecting the Amazon. Unfortunately, and this is our perspective, it is a lot of lip service. However, when you're looking at the continued threats to the Amazon, of course, there are initiatives within that are forward thinking, but there, for example, there isn't any mention of one of the biggest threats to the Western Amazon, which is oil and mineral extraction. And we have to deal with our extraction problem. And when we think about California, I would be remiss in saying that over 40% of the oil that comes out of the Amazon comes to California. And so, if we're going to be a climate leader here in California, and we also have to deal with our fossil fuel extraction problem. And, our state has made, much more commitments than many other places on the planet to advance climate leadership. But we also need to deal with our fossil fuel import and extraction problem here. And I'm referring to fracking. But, there are and this is when, we're talking about, then we talk about a global Green New Deal. What does that really look like? What does that look like for, the United States? What does that look like for the Amazon, right? We're talking about a shift from extraction, from destruction to renewables, to, to a just transition to renewables also means jobs. It doesn't mean the fossil fuel industry, all of the workers are going to all of a sudden be out of jobs. It means a creation of jobs. Even in a place like Ecuador, I know we're mostly talking about Brazil, but even in a place like Ecuador, if you transition fossil fuel jobs to renewables, there's a massive increase in job creation. And so, back to like the international, cooperation. There are governments who have offered support for investing in fire, putting out the fires. France, for example, and when they do, they are attacked as attacking Brazilian sovereignty. Joe Biden last week in the presidential debate made an announcement about $20 billion fund for the Amazon. Not much of us know a lot about that, but there is I think what that means is that the global community is concerned about the Amazon. The global community saw the fires last year, are seeing the fires this year, and want to work together to protect one of the global treasures of our planet, with money, with investment. There used to be there still is the Amazon Fund, but it's not what it used to be. There needs to be reinvestment, a global commitment, we call it a commitment or a treaty to invest in and protect the Amazon. And they're just, as I mentioned earlier, there are governments in the EU who are saying, we're not going to trade. We're going to put a halt on the Mercosur trade agreement. That's the stick, right? That's we're not going to do that until you do this, until you commit to zero deforestation, until you commit to respecting rights. So there are global initiatives. There are possibility of global treaties and investments. This is also, this is by governments, this is by NGOs, and it's also by scientists. There's a science panel on the Amazon that has very similar recommendations about, global commitments for the Amazon. And it is really what we all need.
Mm-hmm. And feeding that science into the policy and the commitments is so crucial. I'm sure Dan will be the first person to attest to that. But Dan, what are you seeing, or what would you like to see more of at the international level?
For me, the two examples capture our challenge. A forest conserving farmer today in the Amazon has a property that's worth far less than his neighbor who's a forest clearing farmer. An average price today for a hectare of forest is $400, varies. Average price for a cleared hectare is $1,400. That same hectare of forest kept standing is avoiding about $55,000 in damages to the global economy through climate change. So a difference of $1,000 in land value is what's driving the loss of forest that causes 50 times more damages to the global economy, and we haven't figured this out. There's no system today for getting any rewards or compensation to the farmer who's doing the right thing. The soy moratorium did not make an exception for legally compliant forest conserving farmers. It was a blanket agreement. I think it was incredibly important, but for me, that points to the need to optimize environmental advocacy campaigns. We need the stick. We need to create risk around those associated with bad actors, but we need to push investors and push buyers into the Amazon to reward the good actors. Another example is, and we just published this, 6 years after the Rio Branco Declaration, states and provinces that contain a third of the world's tropical forest promised to reduce deforestation 80% by 2020 with sufficient finance and sufficient partnerships. And this paper led by Stickler, I can send the link later, but basically found that the only funding that came forth, a third of the world's tropical forests, almost the entire Amazon, was $25 million from Norway. And there was no other response. So the jurisdictions, the states and provinces in the front line of the tropical deforestation challenge are feeling like if they want to take this on, no one cares. There's no money. The companies don't want to partner with them. They might get whacked by a campaign. So don't get me wrong. I think the environmental advocacy campaigns are critical. They've gotten companies to the table, but now we need to optimize them. So we're pushing companies and investors into good programs and good policies and initiatives in the tropics. And one way to do that is through the forest carbon market. And right now it's going mostly to isolated projects, and those are very varied. There's some like the Yurok in California that are incredibly powerful, and there's bad projects. We do not yet have jurisdictional programs that include systemic, comprehensive support for the indigenous people in those territories, like the states of Acre or the states of Mato Grosso have or are developing. They're not getting any funding for that. There's international donor type money coming in through results-based payment programs, 50 million euros to Mato Grosso from Germany and the UK, for example. But we need more. And that would be one way of getting the positive signal to the farmers, the smallholders, to community enterprises in indigenous territories, to the state agencies, that this year 700 law enforcement officials in Mato Grosso couldn't go to the field for part of the fire season because there wasn't enough money to pay for the per diems for them. I mean, it's a few $100,000. And that's, Leila mentioned COVID. It's depleted the budgets for this issue, and it's shifted attention to public health as it should. So anyway, I think we need urgently carrots on the ground recognition for those in a position to solve these issues.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to just add that, while, we also, if we look at the area of the Amazon that is protected by indigenous people, it's about 30%. And, at Amazon Watch, we really, we focus on that, and we focus on ensuring that those lands, those ancestral territories, those peoples are, our lands are protected, and they have the tools to be able to defend their ancestral territory. And, they want direct investment. And this is a big debate we don't have time to get into, but they want direct support. Many don't want it to go through their governments, because their governments are actually the ones that are promoting these destructive policies, whether it's agribusiness expansion or fossil fuel extraction. So, there are many initiatives where you can directly support indigenous-led solutions. All the way from the Western Amazon, whether it be the Sacred Headwaters Initiative, where indigenous peoples are leading proposals to protect over 74 million acres of rainforest territory, and proposing solutions for alternative solutions to indigenous-led solutions to land management, to health and education. And so this is just one example, there's many, but that is one of the critical, debates that happens is, how can, international governments, institutions, NGOs, funders directly support these solutions that are led by indigenous peoples, and whether it's Khoika or Apibi or the Sacred Headwaters Initiative or the Amazon Corridor or the, Instituto Hauni that's, directly, working with the Kayapo people for their demarcation and defense. From our side, we really see, the indigenous peoples wanting direct investment and support for their initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for raising that message during the course of this conversation. I know that we've gone a bit over time here. It's been a really fascinating conversation, though. We've gone from waking up to dark skies and the new reality in California to global economics and pandemics and how it all ties together. And I think there's just no escaping the reality that all these systems are so linked, and it will take a lot of effort to confront them. But thank you so much for your time, Layla and Dan. You've been so wonderful to talk to, and also so open in the chat groups, sharing your links and your information. So I encourage everyone who's listened to check out those links and delve deeper into these topics, because they're not simple and they take time. But thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck braving the air quality in California. And to everyone who's listening, we'll see you back on the next GLF Live. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing, Gabriel.